A melody lost in silence hides a killer's secret. Welcome to Shadow Code, I am Thornwick. Drop your location in comments. I read them all. The violin case leaned against my chair like a coffin, and I didn't need Wolfe's glare to know it held more than music. It was one of those October evenings when Manhattan feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for winter to make up its mind. The kind of night that makes even seasoned New Yorkers pull their collars up and walk a little faster, past the shadows between streetlights. I was sitting in Nero Wolfe's office, nursing a glass of bourbon and watching him work his way through a book on Brazilian orchids, when she walked in. Fritz had shown her to the door at exactly 8:15, Wolfe's sacred time for receiving clients, though he'd grumble about it until his dying day. She was tall, maybe 35, with the kind of pale elegance that suggested either good breeding or exceptional makeup. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that would have made a librarian weep with envy, and she clutched that violin case like it contained the crown jewels. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice carrying the faint trace of an accent I couldn't quite place. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I believe someone is trying to kill me." Wolfe didn't look up from his book. This was standard operating procedure. Make them sweat a little, establish who's in charge, and generally behave like the world's most educated bear emerging from hibernation. After exactly 30 seconds of silence, he closed the book with the deliberate care of a surgeon setting down a scalpel. "Miss Vasquez, you play violin." It wasn't a question. Wolfe had that annoying habit of stating the obvious, as if he'd just solved the riddle of the Sphinx. The violin case was a dead giveaway, sure, but there were other tells. The callus on her left fingertips, the slight indentation behind her left ear where the instrument would rest, and the way she held her right hand with the delicate precision of someone accustomed to controlling a bow. "I do," she said, settling into the red leather chair across from his desk. "I'm first violin with the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra." "And what makes you believe someone wishes to end your life?" She opened the violin case, and I understood why it had given me the creeps. Inside, nestled where her instrument should have been, was a single white rose and a folded piece of sheet music. Even from where I sat, I could see dark stains on the paper that sure as hell weren't ink. "This was in my dressing room after last night's performance," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The rose was covered in blood. Fresh blood." Wolfe leaned forward, his massive frame making the chair creak in protest. "The music?" She handed it over, and I caught a glimpse as he examined it. The piece was handwritten, titled "Funeral March for a Violinist," in elegant script. Below that, in different handwriting, blockier, more urgent, someone had scrawled, "Your final performance approaches." "Charming," I muttered. Nothing like a death threat to really set the mood for the evening. Wolfe shot me a look that could have frozen the Hudson, then turned back to our client. "You have enemies, Miss Vasquez?" She laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm a professional musician in New York City. Everyone has enemies. Perhaps you could be more specific." Elena Vasquez took a breath and launched into her story. The Manhattan Chamber Orchestra was, according to her, a nest of vipers held together by mutual ambition and barely concealed contempt. There was Marcus Drummond, the conductor, who'd been making increasingly obvious moves on her, despite being married to the orchestra's patron, Victoria Drummond. There was James Chen, second violin, who'd been angling for her position since the day he joined the company. And then there was Dr. Samuel Hoffman, the orchestra's founder and primary benefactor, who'd been pressuring her to take a more active role in his special projects, whatever the hell that meant. "Any of them have access to your dressing room?" I asked. "All of them," she said. "Musicians are in and out of each other's spaces constantly. We share makeup, costumes, sheet music. It's like a very dysfunctional family." What about the blood? Wolfe asked. Have you determined its origin? She shuddered. I took it to a friend who works at Mount Sinai. She ran some tests, quietly. It's human blood, O negative. That's my blood type, Mr. Wolfe. The room went quiet except for the ticking of the clock on Wolfe's desk and the distant sound of traffic on West 35th Street. I finished my bourbon and set the glass down with a clink that seemed to echo in the silence. Your fee, Wolfe said finally, will be $10,000 plus expenses. Elena Vasquez didn't even blink. Done. Archie will begin investigating. Tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I suggest you avoid being alone, particularly in locations where your colleagues have access. After she left, clutching her violin case like a shield, I turned to Wolfe. He was already reaching for another book, something about the mating habits of Ecuadorian tree frogs, if I had to guess. Well, I said. Well, what, Archie? Are we taking the case because she's in genuine danger? Or because she's paying us enough to keep you in orchids and beer for the next 6 months? Wolfe sighed, the kind of world-weary exhalation that suggested the weight of all human folly rested on his considerable shoulders. Miss Vasquez is indeed in danger. The blood, the timing, the theatrical nature of the threat. These suggest someone with both access and intimate knowledge of her habits. Moreover, the specific choice of a funeral march indicates a perpetrator with musical sophistication. So, we're dealing with a killer who can read music. Terrific. Not quite, Archie. We're dealing with someone who wants us to think they can read music. The piece she brought is a fairly well-known composition by Gustav Mahler, not an original work. Her threatener is either less sophisticated than they wish to appear, or they're deliberately misleading us. I should have known Wolfe would spot something I'd missed. The man had a memory like a steel trap, and the annoying habit of being right. About everything from stock prices to the proper way to prepare sweetbreads. Still, as I climbed the stairs to my room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes New York look like a black-and-white photograph. I grabbed breakfast at a diner on 8th Avenue and headed uptown to the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra's rehearsal space, a converted warehouse on the Upper West Side that had probably housed everything from sweatshops to speakeasy operations over the years. The building's lobby was all exposed brick and industrial lighting, the kind of carefully cultivated grit that screams artistic integrity to donors with more money than sense. A receptionist with purple hair and enough piercings to set off airport metal detectors directed me to the 3rd floor, where I could hear the faint sound of stringed instruments being tuned. The rehearsal hall was a cavern of polished wood and acoustic paneling, with rows of empty chairs arranged in the traditional orchestra configuration. About 20 musicians were scattered around the space, some practicing individual passages, others chatting in small groups. The atmosphere felt tense like a pot of water just before it boils over. I spotted Elena Vasquez near the front of the violin section, her instrument tucked under her chin, as she worked through what sounded like a particularly demanding piece. She looked up when she saw me and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to her practice. You must be the detective. I turned to find a man in his early 40s approaching, his hand extended in greeting. He was tall and lean, with the kind of angular face that suggested either aristocratic breeding or chronic undernourishment. His hair was silver at the temples, and he wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Marcus Drummond, he said, his grip firm and dry. I'm the orchestra's music director. Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. His expression shifted slightly, like a cloud passing over the sun. Ah, yes. Elena mentioned she'd hired a private investigator. This business with the threatening note, you mean? Among other things. He laughed, but it sounded forced. Mr. Goodwin, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but musicians are... Well, we're a dramatic bunch. Elena's a wonderful violinist, but she has a tendency toward the theatrical. I wouldn't be surprised if this whole thing turns out to be much ado about nothing. What about the blood? What about it? Could have come from anywhere. A cut finger, a nosebleed. Hell, maybe she pricked herself on a thorn from the rose and didn't notice. I watched his face as he spoke. Drummond had the kind of smooth delivery that comes from years of dealing with nervous board members and temperamental musicians, but there was something underneath it, a tightness around the eyes that suggested he wasn't as casual about the situation as he wanted me to believe. You and Eleanor work closely together, I said. Of course. She's our concertmaster, first violin. We collaborate on interpretation, phrasing, all the technical aspects of the music. Nothing beyond professional collaboration? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm a married man, Mr. Goodwin. My wife is one of the orchestra's primary supporters. That wasn't what I asked. For a moment I thought he might take a swing at me. Instead, he forced another smile and straightened his tie. I think I've told you everything I can. If you'll excuse me, we have a rehearsal to begin. He walked away before I could ask any more questions, moving toward the podium at the front of the room with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched. The musicians began taking their seats, the casual chatter dying away as they prepared for work. I found a spot against the back wall and settled in to observe. Drummond raised his baton, and suddenly the room was transformed. What had been a collection of individual instruments became a single living entity, the music flowing through the space like water through a riverbed. Eleanor's violin soared above the rest, her fingers dancing across the strings with the kind of effortless precision that makes difficult things look easy. But even as I watched, I could see the tension beneath the surface. There was James Chen, second violin, his eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. There was an older man in the brass section who kept checking his watch, as if he had somewhere more important to be. And sitting in the front row of the audience section was a woman who had to be Victoria Drummond, elegant, expensively dressed, and watching her husband conduct with the kind of smile that could cut glass. The rehearsal went on for 2 hours, with Drummond stopping periodically to work on particularly difficult passages. He was good at his job, I had to give him that. Firm but not tyrannical, with the kind of musical ear that could pick out a single wrong note in a sea of sound. But I also noticed the way his eyes kept drifting back to Elena, and the way her posture grew stiffer each time he looked her way. When they finally broke for lunch, I made my way over to James Chen. He was packing up his violin with the meticulous care of someone who treats his instrument like a priceless artifact. Mr. Chen? Archie Goodwin. I'm looking into some threats Elena Vasquez has been receiving. Looked up and I caught a flash of something, anger, fear, before his expression went neutral. Threats? Someone left a rather unpleasant message in her dressing room, complete with blood. Chen's hands stilled on his violin case. That's terrible. Elena's a gifted musician. Who would want to hurt her? That's what I'm trying to figure out. You two work closely together? As closely as any violinists in a professional orchestra. We share music, compare fingerings, work on ensemble passages together. Any friction between you? He finished packing his violin and snapped the case shut with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. Mr. Goodwin, I've been playing violin for 25 years. I have a master's degree from Juilliard and 15 years of professional experience. Elena got her position because she's sleeping with the conductor. You have proof of that. I have eyes. That's not the same thing. Chen stood up, slinging his violin case over his shoulder. Look, I'm not going to pretend I'm happy about the situation. I should have gotten first chair when it opened up 3 years ago. Instead, they hired Elena straight out of graduate school because Marcus was infatuated with her. But that doesn't mean I'd threaten her. What about the blood? Any idea where? Someone might get a sample of her blood. He paused, and I could see him working through the implications of the question. There was an incident a few weeks ago during rehearsal. As in a broke a string, they snap sometimes under tension, and it caught her finger. She was bleeding pretty badly. Several people helped her clean it up. Who? Marcus, obviously, Dr. Hoffman, a few of the other musicians. He paused. Actually, come to think of it, I think Victoria Drummond was here that day too. She was watching rehearsal from the audience. Interesting. I made a mental note to follow up on that and let Chen go. The rehearsal hall was emptying out as the musicians headed off for lunch, but I noticed one person lingering behind, an elderly man with wild white hair and the kind of thick glasses that make your eyes look like a fish's. Dr. Hoffman, I ventured. He looked up from the score he'd been studying and smiled. You must be the investigator Elena mentioned, Samuel Hoffman. We shook hands. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man who had to be pushing 70, and I noticed his fingers had the calluses of someone who'd spent serious time with stringed instruments. I understand you founded the orchestra 23 years ago, he said with evident pride. Started with 8 musicians and a dream. Now we're one of the most respected chamber orchestras on the East Coast. Elena mentioned you've been asking her to take on some special projects. His smile faded slightly. Eleanor is extraordinarily talented, Mr. Goodwin. She has the kind of technique and musical sensitivity that comes along perhaps once in a generation. I've been trying to convince her to record some solo work, pieces that would really showcase her abilities. And she's been resistant? Elena is cautious. She prefers the safety of ensemble work to the vulnerability of solo performance. It's understandable, but also somewhat frustrating for those of us who recognize her potential. I was getting the sense that Dr. Hoffman's interest in Elena went beyond the purely professional, but I decided to take a different tack. What do you make of these threats she's been receiving? His expression darkened. Despicable. Absolutely despicable. Elena is a wonderful person and a gifted artist. The idea that someone would try to frighten her. He shook his head. I've offered to hire private security for her, but she insists she doesn't want to make a scene. Any thoughts on who might be behind it? Hoffman glanced around the now empty rehearsal hall as if checking to make sure we couldn't be overheard. Mr. Goodwin, I've been in the music business for over 4 decades. I've seen every kind of jealousy, backstabbing, and petty revenge you can imagine. Musicians are artists, and artists are complicated people. Anyone in particular strike you as complicated enough to make threats? He hesitated. James Chen has made no secret of his resentment over Elena's position, and Marcus is going through some personal difficulties that may be affecting his judgment. What kind of personal difficulties? His marriage is in trouble. Victoria can be demanding, and she's not particularly fond of Elena. Before I could ask any follow-up questions, Hoffman excused himself and hurried off, leaving me alone in the rehearsal hall. I spent a few minutes looking around, noting the exits, the sight lines, the general layout of the space. Then I headed back downstairs to find Victoria Drummond. She was in the lobby, sitting in one of those aggressively modern chairs that looked like they were designed by someone who'd never actually seen a human being. Up close, she was even more striking than she'd appeared from the back of the rehearsal hall, probably in her mid-40s, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of bone structure that suggested she'd been beautiful her entire life and never let anyone forget it. Mrs. Drummond. Archie Goodwin. I'm investigating some threats that have been made against Elena Vasquez. She looked up from her phone with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted while doing something far more important than talking to me. Threats? What kind of threats? I gave her the condensed version. The rose, the blood, the funeral. March. She listened without comment, her manicured fingers drumming against the arm of her chair. "How dramatic," she said when I'd finished, though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. "Elena does seem to attract attention wherever she goes. Meaning she has a certain flair for the theatrical. Always has, from what I've observed." "You've observed her closely?" Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. "Mr. Goodwin, I've been supporting this orchestra financially for over a decade. I make it my business to observe all our musicians closely. It's called due diligence." "And what have you observed about Elena specifically?" "I've observed that she's very talented and very attractive, and that she's not above using both qualities to her advantage." "With your husband?" The drumming stopped. "My husband is a professional. He works with many attractive musicians. I trust his judgment." "But you don't trust Elena's." Victoria Drummond stood up, smoothing down her skirt with practiced elegance. "Mr. Goodwin, I think this conversation has run its course. If you have any further questions, I suggest you contact my attorney." She walked away, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floor like a metronome marking time. I watched her go, noting the stiffness in her shoulders and the way she kept her head held high despite the obvious tension in her posture. I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing various orchestra members, but didn't learn much beyond what I already knew. Elena was talented and ambitious. Marcus was attracted to her and trying to hide it. James Chen was resentful about being passed over for promotion. Victoria Drummond didn't like her husband's interest in his concertmaster. Dr. Hoffman wanted to showcase Elena's talents in ways that made her uncomfortable. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with his afternoon, beer and a stack of mail that Fritz had left on his desk. I gave him the full report, including the detail about Elena's blood being available to several people after the string-breaking incident. "Interesting," he said when I'd finished. "And the piece of music? Funeral March for a Violinist. You said it was by Gustav Mahler." "I said no such thing. I said it was a well-known composition, which it is, but it's by Chopin, not Mahler. The Funeral March from his Piano Sonata No. 2, arranged for violin. Does that matter?" "Everything matters, Archie. The question is whether it matters relevantly." He took a sip of beer and regarded me with those small dark eyes that missed nothing. "What was your impression of Mr. Chen?" "Bitter, ambitious, and probably capable of making threats if he thought it would get Elena out of the way. And Mrs. Drummond, ice-cold and protecting her territory. If she thought Elena was after her husband, she might do something about it. Dr. Hoffman, harmless old professor type, but there's something underneath. He wants Elena for something. And it's not just recording solo albums." Wolfe nodded slowly. "And Mr. Drummond himself?" "In love with his concertmaster, and trying to convince himself he isn't. A volatile combination. We'll need more information." That evening, Eleanor called to report that she'd found another note. This one slipped under her apartment door while she was at work. It was briefer than the first. "Tonight's performance will be your last," written in the same block letters as the previous threat, but on different paper. "Where are you now?" I asked. "At home." "I know you said I shouldn't be. Alone, but stay put. Don't answer the door for anyone except me or someone you absolutely trust. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Elena lived in a fourth-floor walk-up on the Upper West Side, the kind of building where the hallway always smells like cabbage, and the elevator has been temporarily out of order since the Truman administration. Her apartment was small but immaculate, with sheet music covering every available surface, and a violin stand in the corner, holding what looked like a very expensive instrument. She was pale but composed, dressed in jeans and a sweater that made her look younger than her 35 years. The threatening note was on her coffee table, along with an envelope that might have come from anywhere. "No one saw who delivered this?" I asked. I asked Mrs. Patterson downstairs. She sees everything that goes on in this building. She said she didn't notice anyone unusual, but the mailman came by around 3 and there was a delivery from some florist around 4:30. Florist? For 3B. Mrs. Chen, no relation to James, as far as I know. She gets flowers every week. From her son in California. I examined the note more closely. The paper was different from the first threat, cheaper with a slight yellow tint that suggested it might have come from a legal pad. The handwriting looked similar, but not identical, which could mean either a different person or someone trying to disguise their normal script. Eleanor, I need you to think carefully. In the past few weeks, has anyone asked you personal questions? Your schedule, your habits, where you live? She considered this. Well, Marcus has been attentive lately, asking about my plans for the weekend, whether I'm seeing anyone. I assumed he was just making conversation. What about Dr. Hoffman? He's always been interested in my career, my goals, but recently he's been more persistent about the recording project. He keeps talking about showcasing my true potential and taking my career to the next level. And James? Her expression hardened slightly. James asks questions, but they're usually along the lines of, how much longer are you planning to keep the position that should rightfully be mine? What about Mrs. Drummond? We don't exactly chat. She's always been polite but distant, though... She paused as if trying to remember something. Actually, there was one odd conversation a few weeks ago. She asked me if I was happy with the orchestra, if I'd ever considered moving on to bigger opportunities. At the time I thought she was just being friendly, but looking back, it sounds like she was hoping you'd take the hint. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. I spent another hour going over the details of her daily routine, the security in her building and the various ways someone might have gained access to her apartment or dressing room. By the time I left, I was more convinced than ever that the threats were coming from someone within the orchestra, someone who knew Elena well enough to understand her movements and access her private spaces. The next morning brought another development. Fritz woke me with a phone call at 6:30. Never a good sign in our line of work. Archie, Eleanor's voice was shaky but controlled. Something's happened. Marcus is dead. I was dressed and out the door in 5 minutes, grabbing a cup of coffee from the deli on the corner as I hailed a cab to the address Elena had given me. A townhouse on East 73rd Street that probably cost more per month than most people make in a year. The street was blocked off with police cars and yellow tape, the kind of scene that draws curious neighbors and makes property values drop. I flashed my license to the uniform at the perimeter and asked for Inspector Kramer, who I figured would be somewhere in the middle of the chaos. I found him in the townhouse's living room, a space that looked like it had been designed by someone with excellent taste and unlimited funds. Kramer was talking to a detective I didn't recognize, his face wearing the expression of a man who'd had his morning coffee interrupted by violent death. "Goodwin," he said when he spotted me, "what brings you to my crime scene?" Client of ours. Knew the deceased. She asked me to come down and see what I could find out. Your client being Elena Vasquez? I nodded. Kramer had been dealing with Wolfe and me long enough to know that we didn't take cases involving choir boys and jaywalking violations. What happened? I asked. Kramer gestured toward the far end of the living room, where a body was sprawled near, an overturned music stand. Even from a distance I could see it was Marcus Drummond, still dressed in the tuxedo he'd probably worn for last night's concert. Victim was found this morning by the housekeeper. Apparent blunt force trauma to the head. Looks like he was struck with something heavy. We're still trying to figure out what. Any signs of forced entry? None. Either he knew his killer or they had a key. I looked around the room, noting the expensive furniture, the concert programs, framed on the walls, the baby grand piano that occupied most of the far wall. Where's the wife? Victoria Drummond is at her sister's place in Connecticut. Claims she's been there since yesterday afternoon, and the sister backs her up. Kramer's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by this alibi. What about time of death? Medical examiner puts it between 10 p.m. and midnight last night. Orchestra had a concert that ended around 9:30, so the timeline fits. Any witnesses see anything? Neighbors heard raised voices around 10:15, but nobody looked out. Their windows. This is the kind of neighborhood where people mind their own business. I spent a few more minutes examining the scene, though I was careful not to interfere with the police investigation. The living room showed signs of a struggle. Overturned. Chairs, scattered sheet music. A lamp that had been knocked off an end table. But there was something theatrical about it, as if someone had worked a little too hard to make it look like a fight. The music stand near the body caught my attention. It was an expensive model, the kind that would be heavy enough to cause serious damage if swung with sufficient force. And there, barely visible against the dark metal, was what looked like a small bloodstain. "Inspector," I said, pointing to the music stand, "you might want to have your people take a closer look at that." Kramer followed my gaze and nodded grimly. "Already on it. Looks like our murder weapon." "What was on the stand?" one of the crime scene technicians answered before Kramer could respond. "Sheet music, something called Funeral March for a Violinist." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The same piece that had been left in Elena's dressing room, the same threatening message that had started this whole mess. Except now the threat had been carried out, just not against the person we'd expected. "Inspector, I need to make a phone call." Kramer waved me toward the hallway, and I dialed the brownstone number. Fritz answered on the second ring. "Is Mr. Wolfe available?" "He is in the orchid rooms, but I believe he would want to be disturbed for this." A moment later, Wolfe's voice came on the line, slightly breathless from his descent from the plant rooms. "Yes, Archie? Marcus Drummond is dead. Beaten to death in his own living room, probably with a music stand. And get this, the same funeral. March that was left for Elena was on the stand when they found the body. Silence for several seconds, then, "Where is Miss Vasquez now?" "I don't know. She called me this morning, but I haven't spoken to her since." "Find her, Archie. Find her quickly." The line went dead. I stood in Marcus Drummond's hallway, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a murder investigation, and tried to figure out what the hell was going on. Someone had been threatening Elena, but Marcus was dead. The same piece of music connected both incidents, but what did that mean? Was Elena the intended victim who'd somehow escaped? Was Marcus killed instead of her, or in addition to planning her murder? Or, and this thought made my stomach tighten, was Elena not the intended victim at all, but rather the person we should be looking at as the killer? I spent another hour at the crime scene, picking up what details I could from the investigating. Officers. Marcus had conducted a concert the previous evening, Brahms and Mozart, according to the program I found in his jacket pocket. The performance had ended at 9:30, as Kramer had said, and several orchestra members confirmed seeing Marcus leave the concert hall alone around 10 o'clock. Victoria Drummond had indeed been at her sister's place in Connecticut since Tuesday afternoon, according to the local police who'd been asked to verify her alibi. Phone records showed she'd made several calls from the Connecticut house between 8 and 11 p.m., so unless she'd arranged for someone else to make the calls for her, she was in the clear for the actual murder. James Chen had gone home after the concert and spent the evening practicing, according to his statement. No alibi except his own word, but no obvious motive for killing Marcus either, unless he thought that getting rid of the conductor might somehow improve his chances of getting Elena's position, which seemed like pretty twisted logic even for a resentful musician. Dr. Hoffman claimed he'd been at home reading until around 11, then had gone for a walk around the neighborhood. Again, no real alibi, but also no clear motive unless there was something I was missing about his relationship with either Marcus or Elena, which brought me back to Elena herself. I tried calling her apartment, but got no answer. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail. I grabbed a cab back to her building and buzzed her apartment from the lobby. Still nothing. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor Eleanor had mentioned, was just coming back from what looked like a grocery run. She was a tiny woman with steel-grey hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she didn't miss much of what went on around her. "You're the detective Eleanor mentioned," she said without preamble. "She left about an hour ago carrying that violin case of hers. Did she say where she was going?" "Said she had some things to take care of and that she might not be back for a few days." Mrs. Patterson's expression was worried. "She looked scared, Mr. Goodwin, really scared." I thanked her and headed back outside, my mind racing. Eleanor was gone. Marcus was dead. And somewhere in the middle of all this was a killer who'd managed to turn the situation completely around. Instead of Elena being the victim, she'd either become the prime suspect or had fled because she knew something that made her a target. I needed to get back to Wolfe and figure out what we were missing. I found him in the office, 3 empty beer, bottles on his desk and a 4th in his hand. He was staring at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man working through a complicated problem. "Elena's disappeared," I said without preamble. "Packed up and left her apartment about an hour ago." "Expected." "Expected? What do you mean, expected?" Wolfe set down his beer and looked at me with those small, dark eyes. "Archie, from the beginning of this case, we have been looking at the situation backwards." "How do you mean?" "We assumed that Elena Vasquez was the intended victim of these threats. We assumed that someone wished to harm her, and that our job was to identify and stop that person." He paused to take another sip of beer. "What if we were wrong?" "Wrong how? What if Elena Vasquez was never the intended victim? What if she was instead the intended perpetrator?" I sat down hard in my chair, feeling like I'd just been hit with a sack of cement. "You think Elena killed Marcus?" "I think Elena Vasquez orchestrated this entire situation from the beginning. The threats against herself, the theatrical elements, the careful timing, all designed to establish her as a victim rather than a suspect when the real crime was committed." "But why would she want Marcus dead?" "An excellent question, and one we'll need to answer if we're going to resolve this case satisfactorily." We spent the next hour going over everything we knew about Elena, Marcus, and the rest of the orchestra. Wolfe had me call Inspector Kramer to get additional details about the crime scene, the victim's financial situation, and any other information the police had uncovered. The picture that emerged was complicated. Marcus had been having financial difficulties. His lifestyle far exceeded his income from the orchestra, and he'd been borrowing money from several sources. His marriage to Victoria had been increasingly strained, with neighbors reporting frequent arguments and at least one incident where police had been called for a domestic disturbance. More interesting was the revelation that Marcus had recently changed his will, leaving a significant portion of his estate to the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra rather than to his wife. The change had been made just 3 weeks ago, according to his attorney, and Victoria apparently didn't know about it yet. "So, we have a conductor with money problems, a deteriorating marriage, and a secret will that cuts his wife out of most of his estate," I said. "Still doesn't explain why Elena would want him dead, doesn't it?" Wolfe was looking at me with that expression that meant I was missing something obvious. "Consider the evidence we have, Archie. Elena comes to us with a story about threats against her life. The threats include references to a specific piece of music and samples of what she claims is her own blood. She establishes that several people had access to her blood, her dressing room, and her personal information. Then, conveniently, the person making the threats, supposedly, ends up dead with the same piece of music at the scene. You think she killed Marcus to make it look like whoever was threatening her had escalated to murder? I think Elena Vasquez is considerably more clever than we initially assumed." She created a narrative in which she was the victim, established multiple suspects with means and opportunity, and then eliminated the one person who could expose her deception. What deception? Wolfe finished his beer and set the bottle down, with deliberate precision. The affair, Archie. Elena Vasquez and Marcus Drummond were having an affair, not the hopeless infatuation on his part that everyone assumed, but a genuine relationship that had gone wrong. I thought about this, turning it over in my mind like a coin. So she kills him because... What? He was going to end it? Going back? To his wife? More likely because he was going to expose her for something else entirely. Marcus Drummond discovered something about Elena Vasquez that she couldn't allow to become public knowledge, such as, that, Archie, is what we need to determine, and we need to do it quickly before Miss Vasquez disappears entirely. The phone rang before I could respond. Fritz answered in the kitchen and a moment later appeared in the office doorway. Mr. Wolfe, Inspector Kramer is on the line. He says it's urgent. Wolfe picked up the receiver. Good afternoon, Mr. Kramer. I see. Yes, that is interesting. No, she is not here. Very well. He hung up and looked at me grimly. The police have searched Elena's apartment. They found several items of interest hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom closet. What kind of items? Love letters from Marcus Drummond dating back over a year. Financial records showing payments from Marcus to Elena. Substantial payments. Far more than her orchestra salary would justify. And most significantly, an insurance policy on Marcus's life, with Elena as the beneficiary. I felt the pieces clicking, into place like tumblers in a lock. She was blackmailing him. It would appear so. The question remains, blackmail for what? The phone rang again. This time Fritz brought word that Dr. Hoffman was in the lobby, asking to see us urgently. Send him up, Wolfe said. Samuel Hoffman looked like he'd aged 10 years since I'd seen him at the rehearsal hall. His wild white hair was even more disheveled than usual, and his hands were shaking as he took the seat across from Wolfe's desk. Mr. Wolfe, I've just heard about Marcus. This is terrible. Indeed, what brings you here, Dr. Hoffman? The old man fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. Elena asked me to give this to you if anything happened to her. She said you'd understand. Wolfe opened the envelope and withdrew several sheets of paper. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grim. Dr. Hoffman, how long have you known about the forgeries? The old man's face went white. How did you... This letter details Elena's discovery that the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra has been performing pieces that were claimed to be lost, works by famous composers, Vivaldi, Bach, Mozart, but were actually modern forgeries created by you and sold to collectors as genuine historical artifacts. My jaw dropped. You've been forging classical music? Hoffman slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. It started innocently enough. I'd compose pieces in the style of the masters, just as an intellectual exercise. Then a colleague suggested I might be able to sell them to collectors who weren't too concerned about provenance. And Marcus found out? Elena found out first. She has perfect pitch, you understand, and an exceptional ear for musical style. During one of our performances, she realized that a piece we were playing, supposedly, a recently discovered Vivaldi concerto, had harmonic progressions that were distinctly modern. She confronted me about it. So she blackmailed you, I said. Not exactly. She wanted in on the operation. Said she could help me create more convincing forgeries, and that her reputation as a performer would lend credibility to the discovery of new pieces. Wolfe leaned forward. But Marcus discovered what you were doing. Last week. Elena had been careless. She left some of our correspondence where Marcus could find it. When he confronted me, I thought I could convince him to keep quiet. The orchestra was benefiting from the extra revenue, after all. But Marcus refused. Hoffman nodded miserably. He said he wouldn't be part of defrauding collectors, that it went against everything he believed in as a musician. He threatened to expose the whole operation, so Elena killed him. I don't know, Hoffman's voice cracked. She said she would handle it, that she had a plan to discredit Marcus if he tried to go public. I never imagined she would. Wolfe studied the papers in the envelope for another moment. Dr. Hoffman, this letter is Eleanor's insurance policy. She's documented your forgery operation in detail with copies of correspondence, financial records, and technical analysis of the fake compositions. If anything happened to her, she wanted to make sure you went down with her. But I never hurt anyone. The forgeries were victimless crimes, wealthy collectors paying for pieces they wanted to believe were authentic. Murder, however, is not her victimless crime. And Elena Vasquez has made you an accessory to Marcus Drummond's death. After Hoffman left, escorted by 2 police officers Kramer had sent over, Wolfe and I sat in silence for several minutes. The case was coming together, but Elena was still in the wind, and I had the feeling we were missing something crucial. She can't have gone far, I said finally, and she's not the type to just disappear into the crowd. She needs money, identification, probably a way to get out of the country. She also needs to ensure that Dr. Hoffman cannot implicate her in the forgery operation. That letter was not just insurance, it was a threat. You think she's planning to kill Hoffman too? I think. Elena Vasquez is a woman with nothing left to lose. She's committed murder to protect herself from exposure, and she's now fleeing from the consequences. Dr. Hoffman represents a loose end that she may feel compelled to tie up. The phone rang again. This time it was Inspector Kramer himself. Wolfe, we've got a problem. Samuel Hoffman never made it to the station. His escort found him dead in the back seat of the police car, apparently from some kind of poisoned needle. And we just got word that Elena Vasquez was spotted boarding a train at Penn Station, heading for Montreal. Wolfe's face was stone. What time was the train? 20 minutes ago. Canadian authorities have been notified, but she'll be across the border before they can stop her. Looks that way. Unless you've got some brilliant insight that can help us track her down. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment. Then, Mr. Kramer, I believe Miss Vasquez will be returning to New York within the next 48 hours. What makes you think that? Because she has one more person she needs to kill before she can disappear safely. After Kramer hung up, I stared at Wolfe in disbelief. Who else could she possibly need to kill? Hoffman's dead, Marcus is dead, and you said the letter exposed the whole forgery operation. The letter exposes Dr. Hoffman's forgery operation, Archie, but it doesn't explain how Eleanor acquired detailed knowledge of Marcus's financial situation, his marital problems, and his personal habits. Information she would have needed to plan his murder successfully. She was having an affair with him. She would have learned all that naturally. Some of it, yes, but not all. Elena had an accomplice, someone with access to Marcus's private, financial information, someone who knew about the changes to his will, someone who could provide details about his movements and schedule. Victoria Drummond. Victoria Drummond. I thought about the ice-cold woman I'd met at the orchestra building, her carefully controlled responses to my questions about her husband and Elena. She was working with Elena to kill her own husband. Consider the evidence, Archie. Victoria's marriage was failing, but if she divorced Marcus, she would receive only a minimal settlement. He had substantial debts and few assets. However, if Marcus died, she would inherit everything, including a very substantial life insurance policy. But Marcus changed his will to leave everything to the orchestra. A will that Victoria supposedly knew nothing about. But what if she did know? What if she and Elena conspired to ensure that the new will would never be probated? How? By making sure Elena was arrested for Marcus's murder before the will could be executed. Victoria inherits under the old will, Elena takes the blame for. The killing, and both women get what they want. Except that Elena proved too clever for her partner. I was beginning to see the full scope of the conspiracy. Elena realized that Victoria was planning to double-cross her, so she created the threats against herself to establish an alibi. More than that, she created a situation where she could kill Marcus, frame Victoria for the threats against her, and disappear with both the insurance money and the proceeds from the forgery operation. But it didn't work out that way. No. Elena underestimated our involvement in the case, and she overestimated her ability to manipulate the evidence. When Dr. Hoffman became a liability, she eliminated him as well. But now she has a problem, Victoria. Victoria Drummond is the only person who can connect Elena to Marcus's murder. As long as Victoria is alive, Elena is not safe. So she'll come back to kill Victoria too. She'll come back to kill Victoria too. Wolfe reached for the phone and dialed Inspector Kramer's number. Mr. Kramer, I believe Mrs. Victoria Drummond is in immediate danger. I suggest you place her under protective custody. Yes, I'm quite certain. Within the next 24 hours. The next day was one of those crisp October afternoons when New York feels like the center of the universe. The kind of day that makes you forget about crime and corruption and just want to walk around the city looking at the architecture. Unfortunately, I was stuck in Wolfe's office waiting for Elena Vasquez to make her move. We'd spent the morning going over the details of the case, making sure we had all the pieces in place. Inspector Kramer had reluctantly agreed to put Victoria Drummond under police protection, though she'd protested that it was unnecessary. She was currently in a safe house in Queens, surrounded by enough cops to stop a small army. But Wolfe was convinced that Elena would find a way to get to her. She's desperate, Archie. Desperate people take risks that rational people would avoid. Maybe. But Elena's proven she's pretty rational so far. Why would she risk everything for one more murder? Because without Victoria's death, Elena can never be truly safe. Victoria knows too much about the planning of Marcus's murder, about the financial arrangements, about the insurance policies. Elena needs Victoria dead, and she needs it to look like an accident or suicide. So what's the plan? We sit here and wait for her to make a mistake? Before Wolfe could answer, Fritz appeared in the doorway with a visitor, James Chen, looking even more nervous than he had during our first meeting. Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin, I'm sorry to bother you, but I just received a very strange phone call. From whom? Wolfe asked. Elena. She said she was calling from Montreal, but that she needed my help with something urgent. She wants me to deliver a message to Victoria Drummond. I sat up straighter. What kind of message? Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. This. She said it contained information about Marcus's death that Victoria needed to see, and that it was crucial I deliver it personally. Did she say where you should meet Mrs. Drummond? That's the strange part. She knew that Victoria was under police protection, but she said Victoria would agree to meet me if I told her the message was from Eleanor and that it concerned the insurance money. Wolfe and I exchanged glances. This was Elena's play, using Chen as an unwitting accomplice to get a message to Victoria, probably arranging a meeting where Eleanor could finish what she'd started. Mr. Chen, Wolfe said carefully, did Miss Vasquez give you any other instructions? She said I should tell Victoria to meet me tonight at 9 o'clock at the orchestra's rehearsal hall. She said Victoria would understand why. And you agreed to do this? Chen looked uncomfortable. Elena sounded desperate, Mr. Wolfe. She said she was in terrible danger and that this was the only way she could clear her name. I felt sorry for her. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked up at Chen with an expression I recognized, the look of a man who just figured out how to catch a very clever fish. Mr. Chen, I want you to deliver that message exactly as Miss Vasquez requested. Sir. Tell Mrs. Drummond that Elena wants to meet with her at the rehearsal hall at 9 o'clock tonight, but make one small addition. Tell her that you'll be there as well, as a witness to whatever Elena has to say." "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand, Mr. Chen. You simply need to do exactly as I've instructed." After Chen left, I turned to Wolfe with raised eyebrows. "Care to let me in on the plan?" "Elena is counting on Victoria coming to the meeting alone, where she can kill her and make it look like an accident or suicide. But if Victoria knows that Chen will be there as well, she'll insist on bringing police protection, and Elena will walk into a trap. Elena will walk into a trap." At 8:30 that evening, I was crouched behind a row of seats in the orchestra's rehearsal hall, wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a .38 that I hoped I wouldn't have to use. Inspector Kramer was positioned near the stage with 2 plainclothes detectives, while Victoria Drummond sat in the front row, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. James Chen was there too, fidgeting with his violin case and checking his watch every 30 seconds. He'd delivered Elena's message as instructed, and Victoria had agreed to the meeting, but only with full police protection. At exactly 9 o'clock, the lights in the rehearsal hall went out. "Nobody move." Kramer's voice cut through the darkness. "This is the police." But there was no response, just the sound of someone moving quietly through the space. A moment later, emergency lighting kicked in, casting the hall in an eerie red glow. Elena Vasquez was standing at the back of the hall, no longer the elegant violinist who'd walked into Wolfe's office 3 days earlier. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and she held something in her right hand that caught the emergency lighting like metal. "Hello, Victoria," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustic space. "I think it's time we finished our conversation." Victoria. Drummond stood up slowly, her face pale but determined. "Elena, I thought you were in Canada." "I never went to Canada. I've been watching, waiting for the right opportunity." Elena began walking down the center aisle, and I could see now that she was carrying a gun. "You thought you were so clever, planning to let me take the blame for Marcus's murder while you collected the insurance money." "I don't know what you're talking about." Elena laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Don't lie to me, Victoria. You're the one who told me about Marcus's financial problems, about the changes to his will, about his schedule on the night he died. You wanted him dead just as much as I did. That's not true, isn't it? You married him for his connections, his position in the music world. But Marcus was never going to give you what you really wanted. Social status, financial security, respectability. He was a dreamer who cared more about music than money." Victoria's composure was cracking. "He was having an affair with you. And you didn't care about that, did you? You cared about the insurance money, about the inheritance, about finally being free of a husband who embarrassed you with his debts and his middle-class sensibilities." Elena was now halfway down the aisle, the gun trained on Victoria. I could see Kramer and his people moving slowly, trying to get into position without spooking her. "You were supposed to keep quiet," Elena continued. "Take your insurance money, play the grieving widow and let me disappear. But you got greedy. You wanted me arrested so you could inherit under the old will too. The police would have figured it out eventually. Maybe. But I wasn't going to let you destroy me to save yourself." Eleanor raised the gun, and that's when James Chen did something completely unexpected. He opened his violin case and pulled out his instrument, tucking it under his chin as if he were about to perform. "Elena," he said quietly, "do you remember the first piece you ever played for the orchestra?" She turned toward him, confused. "What?" "Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, the Chaconne movement. You said it was about transformation, about taking a simple theme and creating something beautiful and complex from it. James, this isn't the time." "But it is, Elena. Don't you see? You took a simple problem. Marcus threatening to expose the forgeries, And you created something beautiful and complex from it. A perfect murder disguised as self-defense. Elena's hand was shaking now, the gun wavering between Victoria and Chen. "Shut up! You never planned to kill Victoria tonight, did you? You planned to kill me." The rehearsal hall went dead silent, except for the hum of the emergency lighting. James Chen, the jealous second violinist who killed his conductor out of professional rivalry, then came after the concertmaster who could expose him. Victoria. Drummond, the grieving widow who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time when the murderer came back to eliminate witnesses. Elena's face was white with rage. "You don't know anything. I know you never went to Montreal. I know you've been hiding somewhere in the city, waiting for the right moment to tie up the loose ends. And I know you chose this location because you wanted the poetic justice of killing us both in the place where your career began." Chen began to play, his violin singing out a haunting melody that filled the acoustic space like water flowing into a bowl. It was beautiful and sad and somehow inevitable, like a funeral march for dreams that had gone wrong. Elena stood frozen, the gun still in her hand, but no longer pointed at anyone in particular. The music seemed to wash over her like a tide, and for a moment I thought she might actually surrender. Instead, she turned the gun on herself. "Elena, don't!" Victoria's voice cut through the music, surprising everyone, including herself. But Elena wasn't listening. She pressed the barrel against her temple and looked out at all of us, the police, Victoria, Chen with his violin, the scattered music stands and empty chairs that had been the setting for so much ambition and jealousy and frustrated desire. "I was supposed to be great," she said, so quietly I almost couldn't hear her over Chen's playing. "I was supposed to matter." The gunshot echoed through the rehearsal hall like thunder, cutting off Chen's violin mid-phrase and leaving us all in a silence that seemed to go on forever. 3 weeks later, I was back in Wolfe's office, finishing up the paperwork on the case and watching him work his way through a bottle of beer that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. The full story had come out in bits and pieces during the police investigation. Elena Vasquez had indeed been blackmailing Marcus Drummond, but not over an affair, over the forgery operation she'd discovered and demanded to join. Marcus had been planning to expose both Elena and Dr. Hoffman to the authorities, which would have destroyed Elena's career and sent her to prison. Victoria Drummond had been genuinely surprised by her husband's death, but she'd quickly figured out that Elena was responsible. Instead of going to the police, she'd tried to use that knowledge to extract a share of the insurance money. The plan had backfired when Eleanor realized that Victoria would always be a threat to her freedom. Dr. Hoffman's death had been the result of a poisoned acupuncture needle. Eleanor had studied alternative medicine before turning to music, and she'd used that knowledge to create an untraceable murder weapon. James Chen's intervention at the rehearsal hall had probably saved both his life and Victoria's, though he'd never intended to be a hero. He'd simply recognized that Elena was planning something terrible and had tried to reach whatever humanity remained in her. "Satisfactory conclusion?" Wolfe asked, not looking up from his book. "I suppose Elena's dead, the forgery operation is exposed, and Victoria gets to keep her insurance money. Justice of a sort. Justice is a luxury, Archie. Truth is a necessity. And what truth did we discover in this case?" Wolfe closed his book and regarded me with those small dark eyes that missed nothing. "That silence can be more dangerous than sound. Elena Vasquez spent years building a reputation as a brilliant musician, but she was terrified that people would discover the mediocrity beneath the performance. Rather than accept that limitation, she chose to destroy everyone who threatened, to expose it, including herself. Including herself. I finished my bourbon and set the glass down, thinking about Elena's last words. I was supposed to be great. I was supposed to matter. In a city full of people chasing dreams that would never come true, maybe that was the most honest thing she'd ever said. The violin case was still leaning against my chair where Elena had left it that first night, and every time I looked at it, I was reminded that some coffins are made of music, and some performances end in silence. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't care about the elegance of the composition or the skill of the performer. It just is, waiting patiently for someone willing to hear it above the noise of ambition and fear and desperate desire. Elena Vasquez had been a gifted violinist, a clever criminal, and ultimately a woman who'd chosen murder over mediocrity. The music would go on without her, played by other hands in other halls, but the silence she'd created would echo in the empty spaces between the notes. Even now, weeks later, I find myself wondering about the choices we make when we're afraid of being ordinary. Was Elena's real crime the murders she committed, or was it the silence that drove her to them? The inability to accept that being good enough might actually be enough. What drives someone to destroy everything rather than risk being seen as less than perfect? If you were in my position, sitting in that rehearsal hall with a desperate woman pointing a gun at innocent people, what would you have done differently? Would you have tried to talk her down, or would you have let Kramer's people handle it their way? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what you think about the price of perfection in a world that demands excellence. In this, business murder always has an audience, but only the truth gets a standing ovation, and Nero Wolfe never misses the final note.